Good afternoon. Hello, my name is Hetal Challa. I am the chair of the Lawyer Wellness Committee for the Young Lawyers Division of the Virginia Bar Association. I'm also the wellness coordinator at the Supreme Court, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this panel today about unwrapping holiday stress for attorneys. I do want to point out that, even though the title specifies attorneys, this is really for all legal professionals. So whether you're a clerk or a magistrate or paralegal, please know that I think this is going to be informative for all of us. So we are really fortunate to have quite a diverse group of panelists today. And we are going to be covering lots of important topics. We're going to be talking about, what it's like to balance stress around the holidays. We're going to be talking about, what it's like to navigate holiday parties where there's alcohol. How do we balance having children and keeping up with work? How do we prioritize our self-care? And great tips for flourishing in the new year. So I'm going to start off and let the panelists introduce themselves. So Andrew, would you like to go first?
Sure, I can go first. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Cook. So I'm actually not a lawyer. I'm not in the profession. I am currently a doctoral student in clinical psychology here at Regent University. I'm really just here to help add to the conversation about how to manage stress and self-care and all of those things really from a clinical perspective. And I do have to give one little quick plug. So I currently work at the on-campus Psychological Services Center clinic for Regent University, where we do community services, so therapy and assessment at a very discounted price. So if any of you are in the area and need any kind of help, you can come to us. Thanks.
Tommy?
Thanks so much. It's so nice to know that there are some members on the panel that aren't from the directly from the legal community. It's nice to have some perspective. I am an attorney. I'm a solo practitioner in Richmond. I've been in practice for about 6 years. I've been a solo for almost 4 years, and I'm also a family man. I've got 2 young children and a wife at home. So part of what our conversation with me today will be is sort of balancing the balancing act that goes on at the holidays, where you have so many personal commitments on top of so many professional commitments, and then how that stress plays into your decision making.
Thank you. Janie?
Greetings, everybody. My name is Janie Rhoads. I am an attorney here at the law firm of Hirschler. I am in their Richmond office, and I specialize in commercial real estate. Also, and this is kind of my pride, and something I've been doing for probably 15 years, is I'm really involved with the Virginia Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program. Started out as a volunteer, which was wonderful, and have been serving on the board of directors for a while now. And we'll be talking about that later as well. I too have a very small family, my husband, and we have a 17-year-old son as well. So am familiar with, kind of juggling the family life, legal practice, and the things that we do. So glad to be here today.
Thank you, Janie. And speaking of the Virginia Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program, Charlene?
Yeah, that was a perfect segue. Thank you, Janie. I am Charlene Reilly. I am the Education Outreach Manager for Virginia Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program. Prior to joining JLAP, I practiced law for about 20 years. So I'm very familiar with some of the occupational risks and stresses that affect us in the community. I, like Janie and Tommy and others on the panel, I have a family, 3 children, 11 and twins that are 9. So I am really excited about being part of this panel and talking about some of these stresses and stressors over the holiday season. I think it's going to be a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlene. And last but not least, Dan.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name's Dan Blom. I'm an attorney at Chadwick, Washington, Moriarty, Elmore, and Bunn in Fairfax, Virginia. My practice focuses on representing community associations. I recently started volunteering with Virginia Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program And I'm just happy to be here and get things started and share some practical tips on how to deal with some of the holiday stresses we deal with in the legal profession, but also kind of everybody deals with in the world out there.
Great. Thanks, Dan. All right. Well, before we get started, I want to just briefly just kind of lay a foundation as to why we're even talking about stress amongst the legal community. And many of you already may be familiar with kind of what started the ball rolling. And that really was the national study that happened in 2016, the Hazleton study that was done with the ABA, as well as the American Bar Association, the Hazleton Betty Ford Foundation. And that national study really revealed a lot of alarming statistics related to, attorney burnout and depression and suicide, anxiety, just a whole, slew of issues. And nationally, this really got a lot of attention. And the Supreme Court and Virginia has really been very proactive about trying to outline a plan to address these issues. That led to a task force being created, as well as a profession at risk report that was published, which outlined a series of recommendations. And I just want to highlight, one of the most critical things that came out of that, and that was really the collaboration with VJ Lab, which is Charlene's office. And that is really important because VJ Lab really serves a very important role with supporting all legal professionals, not just attorneys. So like I said, if you're a clerk or a magistrate or anyone even tangentially involved with the legal profession, VJ Lab is there to support. It's confidential, it's free of charge. And, we're going to put in some information in the chat, 24/7 hotline, their information. And Charlene, as we go through the presentations, she's going to get an opportunity to also talk about VJ Lab. So but we have a lot of exciting things to unwrap. Hopefully, if we unwrap those things today before the holidays, we're going to really set the stage to ensure that all of you have the tools that you need to, not only have a very happy holiday, but flourish in the new year. So let's get started with really talking about what is it about the holidays that is so difficult for the legal profession. When we think about Christmas, it's such a joyful time. We connect with friends and family, but for some legal professionals, it actually is very challenging. So let's talk about that. What are the occupational risks of lawyers, and why are the holidays a stressful time for the profession? So let's start with the occupational risks. And those of you that are listening, if you can please write in the chat, what are some of the most stressful things about being in the profession in the holidays? If you could please just, participate. We want this to be an interactive panel, and we will definitely leave time at the end for questions. But in the meantime, we would definitely like you all to participate in the chat. So what is it that is stressful?
Well, I'm happy to chime in and appreciate the introduction of JLAP at the beginning and what it's here to, and those it's here to help. So from my perspective, and I can only speak personally, it's, practicing law, and then you've got Christmas on top of it. So it's another thing. It's Christmas cards, it's presents, it's the trees and decorating. And so for me, it's just another thing that needs to be done. And I don't want to take the joy out of the season because there's a lot with that. But it is kind of difficult to remember the joy and what it's all about. So that's, from my personal perspective, one of the challenges.
Completely agree. For me, my schedule feels like it just gets out of control with all the extra social pressures for various events and things like that. And with kids, I have a young daughter as well. The various things that you get to do with them that are fun and festive, while also maintaining a practice can be very difficult. And as Janie said, not to take away from the joy from the season, because there is a lot of joy, but it just adds a layer of stress, all this extra stuff. And add to that for attorneys in private practice, billable hours and the end of the year, with the pressures for billable hours. That I think adds a lot to a lot of attorney stress, including my own.
Dan, thank you so much. And we did get a comment in the chat that I think the volume might be a little bit low. I think some of the participants are just having a little difficulty hearing. If you could just increase the volume just a little bit. But those are all really great suggestions that you offered. And on that note, Dan, billable hours, I'm just looking at the chat, has come up quite a bit for the attendees as being a big stressor. Janie, I know that you have mentioned billable hours quite a bit in our, not only last year, but as well as on our planning calls. What suggestions can you offer for some of those, attorneys that are struggling with this?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, in private practice, and that's all I've ever done since I graduated from law school, and it's all I know. When you're billing at, tenths of an hour, it's difficult. And the models, I know that there have been firms that have tried. I don't know if they've been successful in adopting models that don't focus on the billable hour, but we charge by the hour, and so, or at least our firm does, and a lot do. So it's really a challenge. What I try to do, and I'm seeing a lot of comments pop up about vacations, is I do try to take 3 weeks of vacation. It's really important for me. But with that being said, it's usually very painful before I leave and really painful when I come back. But for me, when I go on those vacations, I do not work. Now, I understand this may not be practical for all practices. I'm a commercial real estate. It may be easier for me than someone who has a trial, certainly. But, I do take vacation. And then on the weekends, I do try not to work. And so what that does is it condenses my work week, but it ensures that I have protected time that I can spend with my family, and I can decompress. But it's a constant, it's a tough one, right? Because we've got our requirements. And I just think that unless a model can change, that's going to be a constant stressor for us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Janie. Tommy, anything that you can relate to?
Yeah, this just makes me think. I haven't been on a billable hour model in a few years, but my first job out of law school was at a bigger practice that did a billable hour quota. And something I remember reflecting on with my boss, perhaps I remember it more fondly than I experienced it, was sitting down in January or February and talking about something of a lull in time billed in December and January. And it was like I didn't have the forethought to pull my calendar up with my managing partner and say, yeah, I understand maybe I only billed 120 hours in December or something like that. It's my first year of practice and I'm within the first 3 or 4 months of practice. But if you look at my calendar, it's not filled with social engagements that occur outside of the practice. These are all commitments that I made within the practice, and they're invitations that I thought I was sort of duty bound to accept. So in hindsight, I wish I would have come to those conversations maybe a little bit better armed with an explanation for why there might have been a lull there. And maybe that's a conversation that I should have had before the holidays hit. And I could see that I wasn't ticking off those 40 build hour weeks during the month of December. I regret not doing that now. And for anyone that's in that position, I would highly suggest that you communicate. That's the best way to keep a good relationship with your boss or bosses. In those corporate practices, I found I was in commercial real estate like Janie. I was answering to a lot of different people, from sort of senior associates to managing partners. And it can get confusing to know how you can serve that many people at once. So yeah, communicate.
The other thing that has come up quite a bit in the chat is managing, childcare, managing time with family and work obligations. And that is a theme that came up quite a bit, I think, in our planning calls. And so what can you guys offer? What has worked for you? Because we know that it is not easy. I'm also a mom, and I know that, it's difficult sometimes with late court hearings, deadlines that are coming up, reports. What suggestions can you guys offer?
So this is something Tommy just mentioned, but communication. So communicating with your bosses, with your colleagues about the various challenges with your schedule to make sure things are getting covered, that you have time for phone calls and meetings during appropriate hours to take care of things. And hopefully where you work, you have the support you need to make sure that you take care of what should, in my view, be a higher priority than your work, which is your family. If that's what you have kids and a spouse, those people should be taking priority over your work, in my opinion. And I know that not everybody is going to be in a very super supportive work environment, but I think to Tommy's point, communicating what the challenges are, what your scheduling challenges are, is important, even in those more challenging work environments that are more demanding and perhaps not as understanding of people with children and families.
Right. And in addition to that, that's a really great point. The support, I think, is a really big theme, because sometimes also getting support from others, maybe not just at work, but neighbors, friends, family, being comfortable to kind of reach out, to additional people. There can not be enough support, I think, sometimes.
Asking for help. I think that's huge, which as attorneys, we often have trouble doing that because we are all very smart and very important people. It can be hard to ask for help, but that's a great point. Not just your work colleagues, but your support system outside of work, your neighbors, your extended family, friends that can help with those challenges. Great point.
Right. And in addition to caring for children, the other thing that has been slowly coming up quite a bit is caring for, parents, caring for perhaps someone with special needs. That came up in the chat as well. Those are all definitely struggles, and the need for extra support is definitely a real one. I want to talk about the other question that I had for all of you, and that was the occupational risks of being an attorney. And as some of you may know, the Virginia State Bar had published 2 reports, and I want to ask Charlene, because Charlene definitely knows a lot about some of those published risks that have come out. Charlene, could you just briefly kind of outline a little bit of some of those risks that the Virginia State Bar?
Yeah, Hetal, I'm happy to. At the start of the conversation, you had mentioned the National Task Force and the work the National Task Force had done. The National Task Force had made some recommendations to stakeholders, but the Virginia State Bar, they actually kind of drilled down and identified risks or stressors that lead to kind of the elevated rates of depression and anxiety and substance abuse in the legal profession. So at the time the State Bar did this, they identified, I think, over 20 occupational risks or stressors that most attorneys, and as Hetal already, you mentioned this, I think this also really applies to most everybody in the profession. But at the time the State Bar looked at this and came up with these, they identified them as lawyer kind of occupational risks. They broke them into 4 categories: physical risks, mental and emotional, adaptation, and self-actualization risks. But they range from sedentary work, managing the long and unusual hours, sleep deprivation, working indoors, the adversarial nature of the practice. So I think for many of us in the profession, we for a long time just accepted all of this. This is just kind of part of what we do, but these really are truly risks and stressors, and we have to be mindful of these things and work to kind of minimize some of the stressors. So, the sedentary nature. It's not uncommon for us to get in a car in the morning, drive to work, and then sit around for 10, 11, 12 hours. Even if you're at court, you're sitting for long periods of time, get back in the car, drive home, and then usually get home and sit on the couch a little bit. So we just have to be mindful of these things and work to minimize some of the harm some of these risks cause, and be mindful of our well-being. I think you're probably going to talk about the dimensions of well-being, but we have to be mindful of that too, and find ways to minimize some of these risks.
Yes, we're definitely going to touch on the dimensions of wellness. And thank you, Charlene. And we do have a link in the chat to the Virginia State Bar occupational risks. So please feel free to check that out. I want to segue into holiday parties because that has been a very hot topic as well. We all know that holiday parties are fun. The social parties that we have around the holidays are fun, but sometimes they can be problematic for some, not everyone, but I think even if somebody is not in recovery or does not have issues with alcohol, I think that some of the information that the panelists can provide could still be helpful. So I want to kind of ask the panelists, some of you are in recovery. So for those attorneys that do have some issues with alcohol, what are some suggestions that you can offer? Maybe we can start first with attorneys that are in recovery.
I'm happy to start. So I'm in recovery, and one of the things that I think is helpful, that will be helpful for people in recovery, but also people who are not in recovery that just have social anxiety about going to holiday parties, because I think there's plenty of people that have that issue as well, is to have a plan before a party and talk to somebody about that plan. A trusted friend, a spouse, a trusted colleague. Talk about the problem that you're facing, whatever it is, whether it's alcohol, whether it's anxiety, whatever that is. Talk to somebody ahead of time about what your plan is before going in. Do your best to execute that plan while you're there. And then talk to that person after to let them know how it went. I think that is key for these situations, for handling them with grace. Another quick tip that I use is to show up early and leave early. So before things get really carried away late in the night, I'm already gone in my bed, asleep, all cozy in my bed. So that's another tip that I have that could be helpful, practically speaking. Show up early and leave early.
That's good. I'm happy to chime in as well. So I too am in recovery. I have not had a drink of alcohol in almost 35 years. So most of my life has been sober. Thank you. But so for me, it's less of an issue now than it used to be when I would go to holiday parties. What I have learned is most people, I was always very self-conscious. I was so concerned that people would notice that I wasn't drinking. And that's because I had a problem. People who don't have a problem don't worry about it. They don't worry about whether they're taking a drink or not. And that was not my experience. So what it always helps me now is when I'm saying no to alcohol is just to remind myself that most people really don't care. But I love also having a plan and maybe being there with somebody so that you have an exit strategy to leave when you need to.
Janie, most people are not thinking about you, right? That's something that is hard, again, for attorneys. That's very hard to get through our minds, that everybody's not thinking about us all the time. But that's a great point. I like that.
Yeah, it's great not to be the center of attention anymore.
Yeah.
That makes me think of that great quote. It's something like, we wouldn't worry anywhere nearly as much what others think of us if we knew how seldom they did. It's like, yeah, maybe somebody's going to notice. I think it's more profound for younger attorneys who are surrounded by a group of fellow younger attorneys that are maybe still drinking on par with their law school or college days. But at any age, if you're in a group that you find someone's trying to put pressure on you to take a drink at the party, or maybe trying to ostracize you for not doing so. It's like, well, this isn't a party for me at all. Then it's just not for me. Like, this is not how I party anymore. You know, whether you're in recovery or you're just somebody that chooses to engage with others on a different wavelength at parties, you know, that just got to get away from that.
Now, how important is having a sponsor? I'm sure all of you do have a sponsor. What role can a sponsor play in supporting an attorney throughout this type of situation?
So a big part of that is what I discussed about having a plan and talking to somebody before and after, figuring out what you're going to do, an exit strategy, and having somebody to call if you need to, even during that party.
Yeah, for me, having a sponsor, they can call me on things, and that's what I need. It keeps me accountable, keeps me real. And you know, they've walked the walk, and so they can provide me with guidance. Now, whether I choose to follow it or not is another thing. And I'm grateful for the fact that I did, within my first few years, do exactly what the suggested, you know, recommendations were.
Thank you. And, you know, as I mentioned before, I think sometimes, you know, parties can be difficult for people who are not in recovery as well. And sometimes, you know, you may be working on health goals. You may have other reasons that you don't want to drink. And sometimes being in that social, you know, situation can add some pressure. One thing that we had talked about before are just top 10 ways to turn down booze if you don't want to drink. And I know, Tommy, you had a list that you thought would be helpful for the attendees, and we're going to put the some of those things in the chat as well. But can you kind of outline some of those things?
Sure. So I want to tell you some of the favorite ones that I found in here, and some of them maybe seem a little nefarious, but one of them is to say that you're on medication. I'm jumping to like one of the more extreme ones first, but this one kind of made me smile. And the idea that you have to explain or justify why you're not doing something that I think is universally acknowledged can be unhealthy. I mean, it's on the label. It's not to say that all drinking is unhealthy drinking, but if it's universally acknowledged that it can be unhealthy, then I shouldn't have to explain why I don't do it. Just like I shouldn't have to explain why I'm not going to have a second brownie. You know, like I shouldn't have to. But if I do, you can say you're on medication that precludes you from drinking. Another good, so I guess I'll use this as excuse. It's really just a way to get somebody that might be pressuring you, either intentionally or at a younger age. I think intentional pressure was more prevalent. Now, as I age, I find that it's sort of an unintentional pressure that might be placed on you, like, oh, do you want white wine or red? That sort of thing. You can also say you're driving. Another thing that it suggests here is to change the subject. And that's one that I found is really easy for me. I went to a wedding last year, and it was a really it was the middle of the summer. So it was a pretty boozy affair. I think it was just to cool everybody down. It was in a pretty hot environment, and changing the subject from what I wanted to drink and just going and getting myself served with a ginger ale was a much easier way of navigating that conversation with my in-laws than it would have been if I had, for example, said, you know, I didn't want to have to throw my hands up and say, I have a problem with alcohol. You know, it just wasn't a position I wanted to put myself in at a family wedding that I wanted to enjoy. So changing the subject is another one of these themes that they suggest can really help people. You know, just if somebody offers you a drink, maybe act like you didn't hear them, or just say, oh, I've already got something, or I've got one on the way. You know, simple things like that.
Right.
And
And
another good one is no thank you. As Janie noted, most people don't care and they're not thinking about you. So a simple no thank you can work very well in that situation.
Yeah, and I think also to that point, you know, usually the ones that do make a deal of it might share a similar problem.
My mother always said misery loves company, and I found that my friends that have gotten more sober or sober adjacent with me over the years are, you know, they generally don't have that inclination to put pressure on people. They're more likely to encourage someone, like, oh, they say they're not drinking. It's like, oh, well, that's good for you. You know, they don't ask for an explanation. They just encourage them and move on with their lives. And I think that that's the movement towards this sort of sober curious, or whatever they want to call it, for those of us that aren't necessarily in recovery, but are, like the health benefit of waking up feeling great every day. It's like, okay, let's get there. Let's get there together, and let's create a community of lawyers and people that are adjacent to the law that are going to support that.
And Tommy, on that note, I want to point out that we have so many amazing comments through the chat that talks about exactly what Tommy just mentioned. And that's normalizing saying no. Someone wrote in the chat that when a person declines food or drink, they have their own reason. It's not anyone's business. We need to normalize people kind of making those decisions. And so I really appreciate all the amazing things in the chat. David mentioned that everyone should have a sponsor or mentor in life, whether they think they have a problem or not. All really great information. Andrew, you have got a clinical background, and I know that you have a lot to say about this subject in general. Do you have some insights that you'd like to add?
Absolutely. One thing that's been sticking out to me, like you said, that reading the comments in the chats and hearing the conversation, some of it tends to be leaning towards like cultural kind of change and shift that's either happening or that everyone wants to happen, or some do. And one thing that I can think about, just even in like whether it's therapy with one-on-one or therapy in a group setting, the reality is you are in control of your own person and your own reactions. You cannot control someone else. And in fact, it is not helpful to think how other people react or think, whether they choose to say it or not. And so part of that is, if you don't need a drink, you can be firm on why you don't need one, whether it's for recovery reasons or not. That's kind of, echoing what everyone else has said. And if you want to change the culture, doing so yourself. And if someone else says, if a colleague says they don't want to drink, and you hear someone say something possibly inappropriate, or, ask, why aren't you having a drink? You have the opportunity in some cases, right? We're all professionals. We understand it's not always appropriate to step in and say, oh, well, maybe they just don't want one. Or you can change the subject right real quick, going off of Tommy's, thing, and help protect that person, and maybe give the person who asked the question an opportunity to reflect. Because ultimately doing things for your own support are how you engage in self-care when you have so few opportunities to do so anyway.
Absolutely. And, you said something, Andrew, that actually somebody wrote something very similar in the chat about boundaries. And I think that's a perfect segue to us talking about something that we were planning to discuss anyway, is balance and boundaries around the holidays. And some of this could be boundaries related to alcohol. It could be boundaries related to your court calendar and being able to say no when someone wants, you to appear on a date that you're hoping to be on vacation. This also can be saying no to family members. Sometimes we spend our, vacation time spending time with families, and for the most part, that might be a joyful experience, but sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes that brings up difficult things in your childhood, or it can, not be pleasant. Let's ask the panelists, do you have any strategies for that? How do you establish balance and boundaries in various areas?
I think you have to practice. I mean, I have to practice. Saying no does not come naturally to me. It probably doesn't come naturally to any of the panelists, right? We want to help. We often want to say yes, but we know what our limits are. And I think it is important that we know no is an acceptable response to things, and we just have to practice it. At least I have to practice it, and I have to work at it. Sometimes it's small little things, and I can work my way up to saying no to some bigger things, but for me it's a practice.
I'd like to add too that it's a daily thing for me, right? What in any given day, what my needs are and what's appropriate changes. And so, I think part of one of our challenges outside of the legal profession is a lot of us are probably type A personalities. And as evidenced in my prior drinking days, there was no moderation for me. And that's true in a lot of things that I do. And it's a constant evaluation of where I am in practicing law as to what are my needs today, and not to do what comes naturally to me, which is, well, I'm going to address and perfect all 6 areas of wellness today. And I'm not only going to do that and address all 6 areas of wellness, I'm going to do it perfectly. And because I'm going to fail. And so, just acknowledge that it is a day by day thing. And that's also a much more forgiving approach. It's like, that's why I don't believe in New Year's resolutions. It's every day. And what do I need today? And it's smaller steps for me. And just, that is part of the boundaries, right? Because if you fill your life up with other things, then, that are helpful as part of that, wellness approach, it evens things out a little bit. So.
And I would like to add just one thing I'm thinking about is a similarity between, the psychological clinical therapy kind of field and being a lawyer is just this boundaries conversation, right? Like, I obviously have clients that may try and get in contact with me at all times. And holidays are no different. Especially a lot of people struggle over the holidays. So with the boundaries conversation, I love Janie, your comment, and we have this saying that perfection is the enemy of good. Right. Like, especially with a type A kind of group, it's probably already on your calendar to go to the gym. So I don't need to tell you to do that. But instead it's, okay, but did you not go to the gym? But can you go for a walk? What can you adapt? How can you change? And just realizing that just as much as you have to have a boundary with, no, I will not get, this report to you on time because I actually do have more time per policy or something like that. You can have the boundary of, this hour is for me and my self-care is going to help me be a better lawyer. So what I do during that time is my prerogative. And when I come back, I'll be better than I would have if I had been here the whole time anyway.
I love what Andrew just said, and I have to respond there because what he just said is those are exactly the words I wish I had the power to conjure up, having conversations like that about setting aside a 45-minute or an hour-long block on a daily basis to go for a walk or go to the Y or whatever. It's setting boundaries is difficult in a corporate setting, and setting boundaries is difficult for me now as a solo practitioner. You're always serving someone, whether it's your boss as a partner assigning you cases, or a client that you're serving directly as their attorney. Learning how to set those boundaries doesn't necessarily come naturally to a person who's a people pleaser. A lot of us as attorneys, I think, tend to be people pleasers, especially if we're like gunners out of law school and we want to show everybody, oh, look how hard I'm going to work. Look how hard I did work. Here's my grades. Here's my transcript. I passed the bar first go round. I'm the man, or I'm the woman. And it's like, you have to take a step back from that and look at sustainability. Like, my mother was so worried when I started practicing that I was going to burn out quickly. I didn't exactly burn out, but I smoldered for a little bit. And I think part of that was trying to hit the ground running a little bit too hard and please everybody at once to the expense of my own health, whether it was physical, emotional, or all around well-being. So setting boundaries is really important, but it's also, you have to figure out ways to judiciously set those boundaries with people that you answer to. So if you're like me and you can only eat what you kill, you don't lose clients because of boundaries that you set. Be flexible with the boundaries that you set, and talk to clients about, well, I know you said you might want this Friday. When do you really need it by, so that we can talk about whether Monday or Tuesday might work, because I could use the weekend to catch up on work. Those aren't unreasonable conversations to have, and they shouldn't be unreasonable to have with your boss. If you're in a corporate setting, you're in a mid or big law setting, you should be able to have that conversation comfortably, but you have to figure out tactful ways to have that conversation that don't make you seem like you want to just veg out the entire weekend, even though you might need to do that. And it's appropriate to take some time for yourself. When you're early on in your career, you have to figure out how to please everybody to the extent that you can without sacrificing yourself to the cause.
One other thing with the holiday season and boundary setting is I have to constantly remind myself that I have options and I get to choose. So with all the extra happy hours, parties, things that we get to do around the holidays that are great and they're fun, I also get to choose whether I go or not. And just reminding myself that I have the option to say no can help me feel better about going to an event that maybe I otherwise didn't want to go to. Just knowing that I had that option can be helpful. So constantly reminding myself of that is good. And then another thing that I do regularly is in my practice, I have a lot of night meetings with clients, and with a family with young children, that can be a little bit difficult. So I will block off on my calendar a couple nights a week that says no night meetings, and will have the time on my calendar completely blocked. And that is non-negotiable. And that is a way that I set a personal boundary in that way, that I just know that those nights I'm going to be home. I'm not available. My family is a higher priority, and I take that very seriously.
So I want to add to that because I think that's a really good point. Two things are necessary in order to do that. One is a recognition that it needs to be done. And number two is a willingness to actually go and block your calendar. And I think once we have those elements, it's a lot easier to set our boundaries.
All great points. Thank you so much. I want to segue into something that we talked about earlier, which is culture, and how do we change the legal culture? And I want to emphasize, law firms and organizational change. What thoughts do you guys have? I've always said that I believe that change has to start from the top, to really send a message, what your values are for the profession. And Janie, you've been really verbal about that as well. What can law firms do if you're a supervisor, if you're a manager? How do we support? How do we support staff?
Yeah, I think, what I just always recognize is just this inherent conflict, right? And having that done and, for, certainly private practice. And, a lot of the larger law firms and, other law firms are implementing, wellness initiatives, and it may come under like some of the, professional policies that they may have adopted. Personally, um, it's difficult. Our firm, we do have a professional standards committee, and it falls under that. At law firms, there is drinking at parties, things like that. I'm not out there to save the world and say that's not what you should be doing. What I can do is recognize, where I am, and know the people that I can share with in terms of, um, protecting myself, and that it's not necessary to drink and I don't have to go to those parties, things like that. But this is a Virginia Supreme Court initiative. I mean, and there's a lot of energy behind it. And I think, as we were talking earlier, there is some movement to not introduce, the alcohol and things like that. And there is kind of a wellness movement. And I'm hoping that if we can kind of, as individuals, support that we can implement change. And certainly if we are leading, if we're the leaders making the policy decisions, there are ways to implement that change within the firm. And so, there are good sources and toolkits that are available on the VSB and the VBA websites that I would recommend folks review.
And the ABA has toolkits, and JLAP is also happy to help. Big part of what we do is that educational piece, right? So we're always happy to work with firms and organizations and agencies too. I think that's a big piece.
Yeah, Charlene, thank you for mentioning that. We've often received, emails and calls from bar associations asking to start wellness committees. Also, if anyone on this call ever wants a presentation, please reach out to Charlene, reach out to VJ Lab, reach out to me, because, we are definitely here to support. I want to make sure that we have time to talk about wellness strategies. When people think about wellness, everyone gets a different image. For some people, they think of, physical wellness, or someone who's eating healthy. But truthfully, wellness has really a lot of different forms. So I want to ask the panelists, what is wellness and self-care to you? What does that mean?
I'll go ahead. So to me, self-care is really putting myself first, because I need to be well in order to serve my family, my colleagues, my clients, the community. I need to be well. That needs to be the number one priority. Self-care means different things for different people, and so people recharge in different ways. They de-stress in different ways. For me, I meditate regularly. I do a regular yoga practice. I try to eat healthy, although I will say that I do tend to overeat. That is something I'm working on, but I try to eat healthy things when I am overeating. But really, it's about what is self-care for me. I also like fresh air and long walks, and figuring out what works for you and reduces your stress levels, I think, is the key there, because it's going to be different for everybody. All those things I just listed that I do sound great and are nice and they work for me, but they're not going to work for everybody. I know friends who play video games to de-stress. That's something that they like to do. They do it by themselves. They can kind of get out of their heads, and that's the way that they de-stress. That to me is self-care. So that's how I see it, is putting yourself first, setting aside time for yourself to do things that make you feel good and make you feel well.
Yeah, and I was going to say something similar, right? It's really individual. It's very specific to each of us, but especially this time of year, I try to remember this all year, but this time of year in particular, it's really the basics for me, because everything can get really overwhelming. So it's trying to get enough sleep, right? Again, trying to eat well, like Dan said. I've been known to go days of just not eating all day and then just eating cereal or soup at night. That's not, or maybe a bag of Cheetos, right? Not super healthy, but eating, staying hydrated and exercising. But the reason I exercise is to complete the stress cycle, really, right? So exercise can be walking, it can be a treadmill, elliptical, whatever, but because we all have stress throughout the day, and I acknowledge that, for me, the exercise piece is really key to breaking the stress cycle for me every day, or combating that stress cycle. I'm sure Andrew could talk more to that at some point, but I try to remember the basics. And then to also be compassionate to others, but myself as well. And that's what self-care is for me.
Thank you, Charlene. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that.
No,
I was just one of the things that's been really helpful for me, and I go through stages where sometimes I'm good about exercising, sometimes I'm not. My eating habits leave a lot to be desired. And sometimes I'm willing to improve on them. Other times I'm not, and there are consequences when I don't. But one of the things that's really important to me are positive relationships. I can pick and choose my relationships. Now, if I'm in a toxic working environment, most likely I have the choice to make a change. And that's, somebody mentioned it earlier. I think it may have been you, Dan, in terms of, we have the power to make certain changes. We can make those changes. And so for me, it's really important to have a support network, both professionally and personally, to help navigate through, these challenges.
Thank you, Janie. And, you touched on the social dimension of wellness. And I think that's a really great time to kind of reference dimensions of wellness. Charlene had also mentioned kind of basic fundamental building blocks. And so one of the things that had come out of the Supreme Court's Profession at Risk report were this concept of dimensions of wellness. And we're going to put a link to those dimensions in the chat. And we've referenced several of them already. And I think that we can kind of highlight some of the things that we've already mentioned. Janie mentioned the need to connect with others, whether that's colleagues, friends, family. Charlene had mentioned the physical dimension of wellness, just taking care of yourself, trying to get sleep, trying to eat well. The emotional dimension of wellness is really important, just staying in tune to your emotional needs. VJ Lab plays a really important role, I think, in that. You know, if you are listening to this webinar and you have noticed a change in your behavior, do feel that you need some support, definitely reaching out to VJ Lab is part of that. You know, Andrew, from the clinical side, you know, I definitely want to give you an opportunity to kind of chime in with emotional wellness. Do you have some thoughts there?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love the dimensions of wellness and that it's split up into different ways, and also understanding that wellness is a process, not an achieved goal. You know, you never get there. And specifically with the emotional wellness and things like that, with the holidays, I think one thing that's easy to talk about and really easy to understand is expectations versus reality. And you can start to get into SMART goals and things like that. But there's this idealized version of the holidays. I think I saw a comment that there's always like the perfect Christmas tree. I have to make sure it's decorated just right. But even with just like, I'm supposed to feel relaxed, I'm supposed to feel joy, all of these things. Well, you just had a whole year of stress. And if you don't give the space to feel the stress, to work through it, to feel the anger, the sadness, the frustration, how are the new emotions that are piling on top going to be felt? And then if you end the holidays feeling empty and lost, and I missed out on these great things, then that's not a great way to start the year. And obviously, this is a year-long process, right? But if you have this opportunity for a 3-week or longer break, or shorter, taking the time to really even, you know, I almost start talking, sound like a therapist, right? Like you can journal, you can go for walks, you can do all these things, but at the core of it, it's just understanding that if you have an expectation of greatness and perfection and wonder, maybe it's going to be a little bit different, and that's still okay, and you can still enjoy it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Just
We
want
are
to add
going-
a quick thing that I heard the other day, because Andrew just reminded me about expectations. Somebody said expectations are just future resentments. So be careful with expectations.
And I love, Andrew, that you had referenced that dimensions of wellness, that you know, it's a journey. It's really a great, I think, starting point and a guide. So we're going to put a link to the dimensions of wellness. We also have a self-care assessment in the materials that I think could be helpful as well. So that way you can look at the 6 dimensions and see where you are thriving, and areas that you know you might need to work on. Charlene is so she's an expert when it's talking about how to assess areas that people are thriving and areas that they might need to still kind of work on. Charlene, do you have any comments at all about dimensions of wellness, or kind of a framework that could be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've included the self-help sheet for individuals to use. I think that's helpful, but just checking in with ourselves on a daily basis, kind of where we're at, you know, physically, you know, have I gotten some movement that day, intellectually, occupationally, spiritually? And again, spiritual doesn't have to be attending religious services. Of course, it can, if that fills you up and gives you joy and happiness, but that can also just be going out in nature, being mindful, meditating. I think it's just being aware and cognizant of kind of where our levels are and checking in with ourselves on a daily basis, not only the dimensions of wellness and well-being, but also on the occupational risks and stressors we talked about earlier. It's just important to kind of be in touch with ourselves, so we know where we're kind of excelling and thriving, and conversely where our weaknesses are, so that we can try and work on those things.
Thank you, Charlene. I also want to give you an opportunity, Charlene, to kind of talk about VJ Lab, any areas that maybe I didn't cover earlier. If you want to share, we've definitely included the information in the chat, but is there anything else that you would like the attendees to know?
Yeah, thank you, and Janie, for talking about JLAP. You both covered it great, but I do just want to remind everybody, JLAP is confidential. It's no cost. It's voluntary, non-disciplinary. While we work closely with organizations like the Virginia State Bar and the VBA, the judiciary law schools, we are an independent private nonprofit. So again, we're independent from other organizations. Sometimes there's this concern or worry that we report things to the state bar or others. Again, it's completely a confidential service. So I just want to reiterate that. Lots of help, provide a lot of help. We can do clinical assessments and evaluations, provide peer support, thanks to great individuals like Dan and Janie and others that are volunteers. And then we also have our staff. We have former practicing attorneys on staff and a clinical manager that's there to provide help and assistance. A lot of education, again, all complimentary. If you would like us to provide a Virginia CLE or a presentation, or even something a little more casual, we certainly can to your firm or organization. We're happy to do that. We touch on lots of different topics, from imposter syndrome to vicarious trauma, talks like this about stress. Again, we're happy to maybe after the new year come out and talk to your organization. We offer short-term crisis counseling. We sponsor events throughout the year. We have a women's legal professional retreat in the spring. We typically do a retreat or a conference in the fall. We have groups, well-being, women in 12-step groups. So really, we are there to help and support you. If you're already using services, therapy services, use us in addition if you think you might benefit from our services. We're happy to help. Again, completely confidential and complimentary. I think I touched on everything. But if you have any questions, somebody had asked if they're in the chat that if there was a Tidewater person. The way we are set up, we do have regional managers throughout the state. Currently, we are looking for a Tidewater person, but this area is supported. So I put our numbers in the chat. Feel free to reach out, or you can reach out to me directly and we can talk. We also have 24-hour services. So for anyone that ever might feel alone or struggling, there is the 24-hour hotline. You can reach out to us. And I also want to tell everybody 988 is another service that can be used. And there's an option to text and message that if you don't want to place the call.
Thank you so much, Charlene. So speaking of New Year's, we are going to be closing with flourishing in the new year. And even though it is, it's very popular to wait until January 1st and set New Year's resolutions, I just want to say that we can start now. We don't have to wait until New Year's Eve. So what are the panelists? Can you offer some closing comments about flourishing in the new year?
I would say, sorry. Well, I would say be reasonable, kind of along the themes that we've been talking about, and some of us being perfectionists, and, set reasonable goals in terms of what you'd like to accomplish. And then if you one day don't exercise or whatever that goal is, just realize that you could just start over the next day. So be a little forgiving.
Thank you.
That's exactly where I was going to go. Is that I've had so many false starts over the past, I'd say 5 or 6 years, where I would say, for example, fitness has always been a big component of sort of my stress management, at least for the last 15 or 20 years of my life. But since law school, I found that managing the demands of a career in the law and getting the hour and 15 to 30 minutes a day of exercise that are associated with a high level of fitness they've been at odds with one another. And so every year would start and I would say, well, I'm going to, try to do the marathon again this year. I'm going to try to run, under an hour and a half in the half marathon, or so something that was unrealistic for me at the time and unattainable. I would make that my goal at the beginning of the year, instead of just saying, well, what if I just try to run most days every week for the year? And finally, this past year, I'm coming to the close of the first year that I've run consistently without taking even so much as a week off in probably 6 or 7 years since the middle of law school. And it's shown me that setting a goal that I thought about and planned ahead of time, rather than sitting down on New Year's Day and saying, all right, well, let me wipe the sleep from my eyes and decide, what lofty goal I'm going to set. Part of the setting a goal that's reasonable is choosing something that's reasonably attainable. And you can do that just by being realistic and maybe talking to someone else about what goal you should set for yourself, so you don't set your sights too high and then experience that disappointment.
Thank you so much, Tommy. And you've referenced SMART goals. And so we're going to put a link in the chat that kind of explains that in more detail. So, well, I know that we are running out of time. So one last helpful strategy that anyone wants to throw out? Andrew, I know that you look like you're dying to.
Oh no. Well, I guess I want to just harp on what I said earlier, is that, regardless of what field you are, you're not going to be the best at what you do if you have no support. So for everyone here, like, being the best lawyer you can be includes self-care and giving time for that, and realizing that you have to be able to relax and actually rest and actually grow, and just your personal life. And so, kind of like, I love how Janie put it, like, you had the idea to put it on your calendar, and then you have to have the willpower to put it on your calendar. It's two parts. So if you can just spend the next 3 weeks reflecting on one of those two that's missing, and then end up trying to have that on your calendar, then that'd be huge, because it's gonna take a long time. It's not perfection, it's just good. That's your goal.
Thank you so much. So I want to thank all of you on this panel for a fantastic presentation. I want to thank all of the attendees for so much interaction. It was fabulous. And I want to wish everyone happy holidays and very, very joyful, safe, and just a prosperous new year. So thank you, everybody.